Thanks very much, Bill, Reverend Fathers, good friends, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you tonight. It's a great honour. I can only conclude that your presence here in such heartening and magnificent numbers indicates that at last the Church has been successful in teaching the doctrine of purgatory. Because, as you know, we Catholics cling to purgatory, especially we journalists. Any journalist who hopes to get to heaven is in love with the doctrine of purgatory. It's our last chance. We're like the images you saw when the American embassy was being evacuated in Saigon, the last guy who grabbed the last rung of the helicopter as it lifted off. So purgatory is our only chance. But the doctrine is that for suffering endured on earth, you get time off in purgatory. Just think of the remission you're going to get because of the suffering you're going to endure for the next little while. I'm also reminded on this occasion of a remark Adlai Stevenson made when he found himself addressing a similar audience. He said, for the next 30 minutes or so, it's my job to talk, it's your job to listen. If you should happen to finish your job before I finish my job, no hard feelings whatsoever. Now, it's so kind of Bill to invite me a second time. It shows he really has a lot to get rid of in purgatory, doesn't he, really? And two of his magnificent sons drove me to the event tonight, and I'd met them before when they were much younger, and one of them had the kindness and grace and honesty to say, you know, I have no memory of that at all. And I think that's because they attended the previous talk and they slept through it completely, which was very wise on their part. But so I'm going to give you a very distinctive view of this question tonight. How does the Church succeed? And of course, what would I know? But on the other hand, as I understand it, this talk is free. It's worth what you pay for it. And what use is a journalist if they don't give you strong opinions? And indeed, one of the great elements of journalistic character is a particular type of courage, the courage to hold dogmatic opinions when you don't know anything about the subject. And I will tell you a little bit about why I've become a campaigner on this subject. And as Bill said, I've written 8 books, the last 2 are about Christianity, and I've got another one on Christianity brewing. So I'm very much a child of the Cold War, and Lenin said, the only thing that counts is this question: what is to be done? What is to be done? What are we going to do now? Now we, I think, want to be a bold minority in a newly pagan society. For us to move forward depends, first of all, on knowing where we are. Now, I think this is a military district of Canberra. I spent a lot of time with the military in my life in journalism, and I'm very fond of military metaphors. A lot of my Christian readers don't like that very much, but on the other hand, you can't please everyone, especially with your metaphors, so they just have to put up with it. One of the key determinants of winning a battle is situational awareness, and that's a term of art the military has for being able to integrate in real time vast quantities of very disparate information from very disparate sources and integrate it in the battle space and use it and take action based on it. And I think the Church has been, nothing I say tonight bears any criticism of the Church. Church leadership with people who've devoted their life to Christ, they're much better people than I am, but nonetheless I'm going to give them some free advice on how they can do even better. But I think the last 20 or 30 years the Church has been very discombobulated. It hasn't understood what's going on in the culture, and that's one reason its response hasn't been as effective as it should be. So my own journey into becoming a public Christian reflects this realisation that we Christians are now a minority, and really not a sizable minority, but very distinctly a minority in Western societies. Elsewhere in the world, religion and Christianity are on fire. In Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in most parts of the world, religious belief is on fire. The world has never been more religious than it is now. But in Western societies, Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Christianity is in quite radical decline. Now, I started journalism way back in 1979, professional full-time journalism. So I've been a full-time professional journalist for 45 years. I've always been a believing Christian, an incredibly bad one. I have no trouble with Christianity in theory, a lot of trouble with it in practice. And it's much classier to have the opposite problem, to be a virtuous person who finds it hard to believe. I am a person almost devoid of virtue who clings to belief because it's true and it's so consoling. My life in that 45 years, indeed my whole life, has been dominated by three institutions to which I've given loyalty and which have never let me down in reverse. The NRL Bulldogs, News Corporation, and the Catholic Church. Now, they've all had their troubles. You know, each one of them has had difficulties, but they've never let me down. And I remember going to an Irish football match once, and the sign that the fan had read, "The faithful never die." And that's the right approach to take to football, to News Corp, and to our beloved Holy Mother Church. But in my 45 years in journalism, and so I'm a very grateful and lucky Catholic, but in my books I aim for that non-denominational sweet spot that C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, the things that we can all agree on, the 99% of content that any Christian who can recite the Apostles' Creed and believe in it agrees on. So I try hard to avoid the doctrinal differences in my books. You know, I don't have a long section on the doctrine of transubstantiation, and I write what I believe about Mary, but I use only biblical sources rather than traditional church teaching and so on. Now, in my 45 years of journalism, I've seen the culture move from notionally supportive of Christianity to being neutral to being now downright hostile. So when I started in journalism in 1979, 90%, much more than 90% of Australians described themselves as Christian. They were pretty bad Christians on the whole, like all of us, they were pretty rackety and everything, but it was often honoured in the breach, but nonetheless the truth was honoured. If the Cardinal Archbishop of Sydney or any bishop in any diocese had something to say, the secular media would be interested in it and they'd report it. And indeed Catholics got more information about what their bishops thought about things from the secular media than they got from the Catholic media, because it routinely carried. So in Sydney we grew up with Cardinal Gilroy and Cardinal Freeman and so on, and they weren't communications geniuses or anything, but anything that they said of consequence was reported in the media with some respect. And then people drew away from Christianity. Lots of reasons for this. We could debate forever why. I think the sexual revolution was a big part of it. There are lots of historic reasons. But in any event, then there was a period where it was kind of neutral, and now there's a period of outright hostility. So I felt an obligation, if chance and history and happenstance gives you a public microphone, you have a sort of an obligation to defend your friends. When we were dominant, it was easy just to be on the sideline and not worry about the battle of ideas and the battle of faith too much, in a public sense. So I never ever denied being a Catholic or anything like that, but when John Paul II was Pope, it was like the Bulldogs were winning the premiership. You could just, from the sideline, you could say, good on you fellas, go the Pope, fabulous, and you almost felt sorry for your enemies because they didn't have anyone like the Pope, and the Pope and Mother Teresa were the two most famous people in the world. They were the greatest moral forces in the world, and you felt everything was in good hands, and therefore you weren't really obliged to take a strong position yourself. But when we were so much under attack and so much marginalised, I kind of felt a bit like Nicodemus in the New Testament. Nicodemus, you remember Jesus talks to Nicodemus and he says, well, who are you? What are you really all about? Jesus tells him. Nicodemus believes, but he's too much of a coward to confess publicly to his belief. Well, I identify completely with Nicodemus's cowardice. I absolutely get it. I'm very fond of Nicodemus. But then after Jesus crucified and died, but before he is risen, Nicodemus is compelled by mere shame and self-respect to go and claim Jesus' body and offer him a proper burial. And this is a great thing, to defend your friend when he is dead and the whole world is against him. And I think Nicodemus is a great inspiration. So I thought I should go and defend my friends a bit. Then the other thing was, as you get older, you realise that you're approaching that conversation with your maker, and there's hope that the door to purgatory is ajar and so forth. And you think, my goodness me, look at the negative side of the ledger. The positive side of the ledger looks a little bit bare, so ought to do something in the positive side of the ledger. And then, of course, the life of journalism is a life devoted to two things. At its best, it's a life devoted to telling the truth and to finding a great story. And I finally worked out that the most important truth is the truth of Christianity, and it's also the best story. So it took me 40 odd years to work this out, but even a blind pig finds an acorn occasionally, so better to get there eventually than never. But then, of course, there was a lot of hesitation actually coming out. Cowardice was a part certainly, but there was also a genuine sense that you're not morally qualified, and you don't want anyone judging the church by your own life. But if you look through the Gospels and the Acts and the early church history and everything, people preached, they didn't preach themselves, they preached Jesus, they preached the gospel, but they had to offer themselves. They had to put themselves in the marketplace and in the public square. And then the other thing, of course, if you leave the discussion of God and religion and truth and Christ and everything only to the morally qualified, it's going to be quite a small discussion. Perhaps only the people in this room. Perhaps not even all of them. Who can tell? So there was a certain modesty about coming out. And then in one of the books I interview a lot of Christian politicians because I wanted them to own their faith publicly. So I encourage people to own their faith publicly. And the Christian politicians, not one of them wanted to do it, and not one of them was a volunteer. I had to conscript them all into it. And the subtext was simple. I just was saying to the reader, look, here they are from Malcolm Turnbull to Bill Shorten, from Tony Abbott to Michael Tate. They're all Christians, from people on the left of the Labor Party to people on the Conservative end of the National Party. And they've run our society. They're the most responsible people we have, and in many respects, some of the most brilliant people we have. So maybe there's something in this Christianity that's worth looking at. But each one of them was impossible to talk into it initially. Kim Beazley, one of the finest human beings I've ever met. I went to ask him if he'd do an interview for this book, God is Good For You, talk about his Christianity. And he said, oh, look, I want to talk to you about this, mate. We better have lunch. So we had lunch, and he spent the whole of lunch telling me why he didn't want to do it. He said, look, my politics is not my religion, mate. I don't want people to think that disagreeing with my policies is a sin. I don't want to stand in the way of some other man's experience of the cross. I don't want to privilege my own beliefs. And so I listened to all of that. And then at the end of the lunch, I said, okay, now, are you going to do the interview or not? And he said, all right, if you insist. And I got Malcolm Turnbull to do it. Of course, I got my very dear friend Tony Abbott, who's been my friend forever, and so on. I got Malcolm Turnbull to do it. And Malcolm does have a really capacious mind, a very clever guy. Once we were going to appear on Q&A together before he became Prime Minister, and he texted me in question time, because you've got to do something in question time, and said, politics is so dull, why don't we talk about theology on Q&A? I said, that's a good idea. What'll we discuss? And he said, how about the Apollinarian heresy? Now, the Apollinarian heresy, as I'm sure you all know, was the heretical belief that Jesus didn't have a human mind. I thought that was an interesting idea, but I thought it'd be a bit hard to work into Q&A. And so I texted him back. I said, look, that's a bit abstruse, Malcolm. What if we just talk about Duns Scotus, the medieval theologian Duns Scotus, known as a subtle doctor for working out how Mary could be free from original sin but still the beneficiary of salvation from Jesus. And so Malcolm said, Butte, we'll have a bet. The first one of us to mention Duns Scotus, the other one buys a bottle of champagne for. So we were going through Q&A, we were talking about the usual rubbish, and discussion turned to me and I said, Look, the problem with the government in explaining economic policy is that they do this with all the approachability of Duns Scotus defining the Immaculate Conception. Malcolm roared with laughter. The audience was a bit nonplussed. Everyone else on the panel said, yes, that's exactly what I thought of it. I've long had that view of Duns Scotus, and lo and behold, next day, a splendid bottle of champagne occurred, was delivered to my house. And I rushed to tell that story because I don't want to be guilty of corruption, of accepting a gift. But so I knew Malcolm really had a lot of theological knowledge, and he was an adult convert to Catholicism and complex guy like all the others, but, so I was campaigning to get him to do an interview on his innermost religious beliefs, the last subject he'd like to talk about. And he kept sending me a text saying, so what is your deadline, mate? And I'd say, next Monday. And then he'd text me on Tuesday saying, oh, I'm so sorry I missed your deadline. And I'd say, that's okay. I've held it open an extra 3 days just for you. So finally he did do the interview, and it had a lovely consequence because he's a super techno wizard and I'm a super techno klutz. And we had to do the interview on phone, and I just put him on speakerphone and recorded him with an old-fashioned cassette recorder. He was recording it with super duper ultra high quality modern technology on his phone, and his recording didn't work. But I took anyway, that's a long digression, but I convinced Malcolm Turnbull, and all of the politicians and all of the public figures that I interview. So the books are typically structured, the first half argues a case, the second half is interview profiles of people living out the case. And most of them are not famous politicians at all, but that's the world I live in. I swim in the world of politicians, I swim in that sea. So I wanted to bring that world to bear on the Christian subject. Most of them are people who just do amazing things because of their love of Christ. I interviewed a wonderful woman, Gemma Cecilia, who has built 3 schools in Africa, the schools of St Jude, impelled to help poor African kids because of her love of Christ. And she's a magnificent woman, and she's very, very Catholic. I did a Zoom interview with her from her school, and she has a little statue of St Jude on her desk, and she says that she became devoted to St Jude because in adolescence her grandmother or auntie or someone said, look, if you're going to pray for the intervention of a patron saint, you better try St Jude, the patron of hopeless causes. For 2 reasons. She said, 1, you are a hopeless cause, and secondly, St Jude is not too busy because everyone confuses his name with Judas, so he doesn't get that many people. And she has had the most wonderful relationship with St Jude ever since. And the schools are a complete miracle. Their first graduates are now doctors. They are the most magnificent thing on the African continent. 3 schools, she did it with no background in education, no financial backing. Now she's a great fundraiser, but talk about learning through doing. Her volunteers would live in Bunnings tents in her garden, and all the rest of it. And she told me, she had this little statue on her desk, and she said, I have an agreement with St Jude. If I ever can't make the budget, I'm changing the name of the school. And now, some people find this sort of sense of the communion of saints and so on a bit strange. Some of our separated brethren, some beloved Protestant friends find this a bit strange, but there are lots of evangelicals, lots of Pentecostals in the book. And I was non-judgmental about people's spirituality. If they weren't worshipping the devil, if they were worshipping Christ and God, that was fine by me. And the sense of unity now amongst the different denominations is terrific. I got very matey with the Pentecostals, and I think they're brilliant in their use of social media and contemporary music. And I got very close to a group in Melbourne called the Planet Shakers, fabulous group of people. And their music is almost all Bible-based, but it's very rock and roll. And they'll have the lyrics up on the screen as part of their visual display. Then a few weeks later, I was interviewing the men at a new Benedictine monastery in Tasmania. And they were chanting in Latin the same psalm that the Pentecostals were putting up in lights in Melbourne. And I thought, okay, well, I don't say that the theological differences between the Pentecostals and the Benedictines are nothing, but this is the same religion. They are worshipping using the words of the same book, the same religion. So in my first book, my first Christian book, God is Good for You, is essentially an argument for the rational, sensible belief in God. So one thing the culture is doing is it's bluffing Christians out of their beliefs, telling them that science has proven that God doesn't exist and that it's all irrational and so on, whereas that's baloney. I read all the New Atheists, never had any reason to read them until I got to do this book. Read them, their arguments are junk. You can drive a horse and cart through them. It's the same old 19th century liberal arguments against God put next to a whole lot of irrelevant science. So Richard Dawkins says the universe is 14 billion years old. That proves it wasn't created by God because God wouldn't waste his time. To which I say, well, Richard, how do you know what God would do with his time? Has he told you this? I mean, what authority? It strikes me as absolutely characteristic of God that he'd spend 14 billion years preparing a beautiful garden for us. That God exists beyond time and space. He's infinite. Why do you think 14 billion years defeats him? And so on. So I found these arguments very, very easy to demolish. But I realised no one was really doing this in the popular culture. And young people, especially who didn't have Christian formation, had no equipment to deal with this. So I think our culture now is post-Christian, Christian and pre-Christian simultaneously. The post-Christians are folks about our age group who rejected Christianity in childhood, remember it as a boring thing that their parents or grandparents did. The Christians are the people of all age groups who have remained faithful to Christian faith or taken up the Christian faith. But the pre-Christians are terribly interesting because we have become so post-Christian that we are now effectively pre-Christian. That is to say, anyone under 45, unless, or maybe under 50, unless they've gone to a very good, very active Christian school, has really never heard of St. Paul, or they don't know what's in the Old Testament, they don't know what's in the New Testament. There's exhaustive sociological evidence that even people who consider themselves Christians have almost no knowledge of what their particular denomination actually believes. I was very surprised with some of the good Catholics that I interviewed who were surprised to know that the Catholic Church believes in the bodily resurrection of Jesus and of all human beings. This was a bit of a shock to them. So this is shocking, but on the other hand, it's great for an author because you've got all this great material which has been around for 2,000 years, but you've got a whole new audience to present it to, and it's fantastic material to present. So my first book, God is Good for You, essentially about the rationality of the belief in God, and then a lot of politicians and a lot of other people about their Christian belief. Then somebody, in response to that book, wrote to me and said, okay, this is not a bad effort about believing in God, but I didn't find in that book the living, breathing Jesus of the New Testament. So let me tell you, writing books is very addictive. It's like being a heroin addict. It's better if you don't start. But once you do it, it's very hard to stop. And you need very little provocation to start again. It's as close as a bloke ever gets to the mystical experience that women know of childbirth. You know, there's a very happy moment of conception, a long and increasingly uncomfortable period of gestation, an agonising climax of delivery. Your first thought after the delivery is, thank God that's over, I'm never doing that again. Then you see the offspring and he's quite clever, you know, and you think, well, it'd be nice if he had a sibling, wouldn't it, you know, and you find yourself just back in the same mess all over again. So the second book attempted to provide an encounter with Jesus in the New Testament predominantly. And then the second half of that book was looking at people who lived their lives on the basis of their encounter with Jesus. So Paul was a fascinating figure because he was not there like the other apostles when Jesus was conducting his earthly ministry. So he's a figure that we moderns can identify with. And the friends of Jesus today are so similar to the people in the Acts of the Apostles and in the early church, especially in the Chinese church where they suffer infinitely more persecution than we do. I mean, the culture is hostile to us, but in China people are really actively persecuted for Christianity or for Catholicism. And I find their resonance with the early church to be quite striking. But having come out as a public Christian, I found that actually the experience was really very enjoyable. There was a little bit of hostility, but overwhelmingly there was fellowship and friendship. So once I was on a plane coming to Canberra, and I had various Christian books I was researching, and I was trying to keep them organised so that no one could see their titles. And then I thought, how pathetic is that? So I left them the normal way. And then as the plane finished, the woman from across the aisle said to me, "Those are very interesting books you're reading." And I said, "Yeah, well, that's true." She said, "Are you a priest or something?" I said, "No, don't be ridiculous, certainly not." And I said, "Well, what's your interest in it anyway?" And she, it turned out, was a member of the Salvation Army of a rank who didn't wear a uniform. And she was just chuffed that there was someone else identifying as a Christian on the plane. So she gave me great encouragement, and I gave her a moment of encouragement. And I think that's just a tiny little microcosm of why Christians need to own their faith. It might be the first time someone hears about Christianity from you publicly owning your faith, or it might be tremendous solidarity which Christians get from each other. And then there were wonderful moments of grace. I was doing an interview about the book on the ABC in Melbourne, the first book, and it was on the Conversation Hour. And there were three people being interviewed one after another about their books or their musical albums or whatever. And the ABC host said, "Now I notice you've got a chapter on the Pentecostals. Those are those people who speak in tongues, aren't they? And they think the Holy Spirit is speaking through them." And I said, "Yep, they're the ones." She said, "Well, I can't take them seriously. That's ridiculous." I said, "Well, I don't know. I think you should have some respect for people's religious beliefs, even if you don't find them convincing or appealing." She said, "Oh, yes, I respect them. I just can't take them seriously. I think they're ridiculous." I thought, well, hey, that probably constitutes respect for the ABC. But one of my fellow panellists, though, was a young Aboriginal woman, a musician who had been collecting the old songs from the Christian missions, the Aboriginal Christian missions, or the Christian missions that Europeans used to run for Aboriginal folks. And she came into the conversation at that point and she said, "Oh, I don't know, I think Greg might be onto something here." She said, "When we're singing the old mission songs in the old Christian mission locations in outback Australia, we very often find that there are more voices singing in that hall than there are people." Well, let me tell you, the ABC wasn't going to contradict her. And this beautiful, generous young woman who then offered to come and sing at the book launch if I wanted her to, I thought, well, that was just a moment of grace from her. There was another moment I was doing a book function in Brisbane, and a lot of folks who are Christians read the book and found that, I made a mistake on page 137, or I got the interpretation of justification by grace wrong on page 93 or whatever it was. Wonderful folks who wrote in and told me all about this. One guy in that category had come along to this book function in Brisbane, and he got up at the end and he said, I want to tell you, this is a very annoying book. A lot of mistakes in it. Don't like the way you've written it. It's very, very bloody annoying. From start to finish, I found it the most annoying book I've ever read. He said, in fact, it's so annoying that I bought 3 copies and I'm going to send each one to the man I most want to annoy. And I thought, well, you're doing God's work, sir, plainly. What a great new line for the cover. Give this book to the person you most want to annoy. And really, it was great fun. It was great fun doing these books. And of course, there is so much fun in the scriptures. Paul, what a fantastic character Paul is. Fell in love with the book of Galatians. And so Paul is a great theologian, a great organiser, a great genius, should be studied in politics, philosophy, literature, as well as in religion. But of course, a contemporary student will never hear of Paul unless they go to a very religious school. And in Galatians, Paul recounts going to see Peter and John and James, the established pillars of the church, to make sure his preaching is correct. He's submitting himself to the authority of the church. That's Paul being meek and mild. Then a minute later, he has a furious disagreement with Peter, whom he calls Cephas, over whether Jewish Christians can go to table with non-Jews and he says, I told Cephas, you are wrong. I told him to his face, you just don't know what you're talking about. Then a bit later on he gets nice again, and then he gets a bit annoyed at the people misleading the Galatians, and of whom he's very fond of the Galatians. He says, these people misleading you, I wish they would all go and castrate themselves. And I tell you don't hear that passage that much in church. This was why it was great fun to read the New Testament as a journalist, looking for the story. I mean, it's right to read it in the way that devoted Christians do, with particular passages, looking for the theological meaning and so forth. But it is also great just to read it for the story, for the character, for the incident, for the sources. And Paul is a fantastically ornery character, bad-tempered frequently, self-doubting at times, loving and generous, often a bit dogmatic, and uncompromising. So there's a wonderful incident where he's in the custody of the Roman governor Festus, and he's in trouble because he's been preaching about the bodily resurrection of Christ. And Festus can't understand why an intelligent man like Paul is causing so much trouble with such an eccentric claim. And he says to him, look, Paul, you're a good guy. I want to let you go. I don't want to punish you, but you're upsetting everyone with this stuff that you're talking about. So just say something mild and I'll let you go. And Paul jumps up and says, I want to proclaim the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, the first raised in the body. Festus goes, Paul, you must be mad. You're crazy. All this study has driven you mad. And that's a wonderful encounter in the Acts. I think the Acts are a great source of advice. So in my last few minutes, with all my travels amongst Christians, and my next book is going to be about what we learned from the early Christians, how we can apply that in a newly pagan environment. What are some of the lessons that we can take in the way the church manages the mission of evangelisation and belief, teaching the truth, going out and converting the nations as Jesus tells us to. You know, Jesus is very uncompromising. When I was deciding whether to become a public Christian or not, I read in Paul, woe betide me if I am not preaching the gospel. I was very reluctant to put the word Jesus in the title of the second book. And I opened the Bible and came upon the passage, and I don't think, you know, I'm not a person who routinely opens a Bible at random looking for a passage that guides me, but I did just open the New Testament that day at random, and I came upon the passage where Jesus says, if you are ashamed of my name, my Father will be ashamed of you. And I thought, okay, all right, okay, that goes on the title, I got the message, fair enough. And the uncompromising nature of Jesus, it doesn't say the culture will be moderately unsympathetic to you. He says the world will despise you for my name's sake. So this little bit of discomfort that we're getting because the culture is a bit unsympathetic to us is something we ought to take in our stride, really. So what are some of the things we can do, some of the positive things we can do? Well, the pre-Christians, the new pagans, are very promising because although they have the limitations of pagans, they also have not been inoculated against Christianity. The post-Christians have sort of had an injection. It's only the strongest, most virulent form of Christianity will get through to them. But the new pagans, they're kind of, in a sense, a medically naive population. You know, you can inject a bit of Christianity into them and you don't know where it will lead. We certainly need bold self-confidence. It's good to realise we're a minority and to act like a minority. We need to demand minority rights for ourselves, and in doing that, we're demanding minority rights for the truth. So this religious freedom controversy that's going on, what it's all about is, can Christian schools teach the Christian faith? Can Christian hospitals operate according to Christian ethical teachings? Can Christian adoption agencies behave in a way consistent with Christian teaching? There's no effort on any of these institutions to impose disadvantage or trouble on anybody else, but the culture is now becoming coercive and demanding, like the old pagan culture of Rome, that Christians got into trouble because they didn't want to cause trouble, but they wouldn't offer a sacrifice to the emperor because the emperor was not God. And the new pagan culture is demanding that Christians bow in obeisance and recite the new pagan mantras. And Christians have to refuse to do that, and that will cause them trouble with the new culture. We can certainly learn professional communications techniques. The church has been slow at this. The Pentecostals have been very good at it. There are all kinds of very basic things you learn. So in any communications encounter, what is your single overriding communications objective, your SOCO? You can learn how to do interviews in a way that is effective, getting you what is the main message you want to get across, and don't swallow the hand grenade when they give you a microphone with a question that is designed to explode you. You respond like Kevin Rudd, where you say, well, the real question is, that's an interesting question, but the real question is, and then you answer the question you want. You must respond within the news cycle. You can't, I mean, in the old days, and there's no criticism of any bishop or anything, in the old days you'd ring up the bishop's conference and they'd say, oh no, so someone has been accused of sex abuse or something. I'm sorry, we can't give you a response on that matter today. The bishops are on retreat, but we'll get back to you on Monday fortnight. No, it doesn't work. You've got to be able to respond within the news cycle. People have got to be on duty all the time and willing to respond all the time, because that's the way every other movement in our society which has any consequence works. You've got to emphasise the weirdness of our religion. Christianity is a weird religion. All of our claims are weird and supernatural. They are they are the natural resting place of humanity, but they are also weird and supernatural. We're going to eat the flesh of Christ and drink the blood of Christ. This is a very weird thing. We've got to emphasise all of our supernatural claims. Angels, miracles. In my most recent book, there's a chapter on angels. A lot of people say, well, why did you do that? I said, well, how can you be a Christian and ignore angels? Angels are everywhere in the Bible. They're there in the Garden of Eden. They're there at the beginning of the New Testament, announcing the news to Mary. They're all the way through the New Testament, ministering to Jesus and carrying messages. And they're there in the book of Revelation at the end, St. Michael in combat with Satan. Now, if you take angels and miracles out of the Bible, you probably take 40% of the Bible away. And if 40% of it is lies and mythology, well, I'm not going to bother with it. I'd rather be at the races. I'd rather go to the beach. If it's all junk, just forget about it. So it's either all true or it's all rubbish. And if it's all true, that's incredibly exciting. And we won't win the culture by trying to be a slightly nicer version of the culture. We'll win the culture by being radically different. Of course, we must always be happy warriors. We've got to be as smart as the enemies of Christianity, but much kinder. We've got to love our enemies. We've got to be kind about it. Our tone has got to be not abusive. Now, as a journalist whose life is one of professional combat, this is quite hard for me. So I've had to develop a split personality. When I'm dealing with normal politics and the Chinese Communist Party and Donald Trump and, you know, the failure of Australian defence policy, I'm more or less as mean as the next guy. But when I'm writing books about Christianity and so on, I just won't take that tone. So the books don't have any culture wars element. I mean, you've got to say what you believe the truth is, but there's, you know, friends of mine read the drafts in advance, and I remember one, I had a passage saying these people in the New Testament were not virtue signalling for a future ABC program. And my friend said, do you really want to say that? That's just pure culture wars. Do you really want to say that? And I said, no, you're right. So I took that out. So there is a whole mountain of discarded insults, which are, although one of the readers of my book is a wonderful Irish philosophy professor, fabulous, brilliant philosopher. A lot of you would know him, but I won't embarrass him by giving you his name. And he has the soul of a drunken Irish lout, and he has the mind of a brilliant philosopher. So he would, you know, stop me from getting Pythagoras mixed up with Socrates or whatever, but also he'd make all these hilarious jokes in the margin. So naturally I put all the jokes into the text, you know, all these great Irish jokes, and claim them as myself. There are things about our worship that we can do. You've got to have good music. I don't mind whether it's modern music or traditional music, it's got to be good. These terrible tuneless folk hymns You know, the church doesn't change its musical style for 400 years, and then it goes modern at the worst possible moment in the 1960s, when the most execrable musical style in the history of the human race, folk songs, has become popular. The rest of the culture has long abandoned this terrible mistake. But of course we tend not to change for another 400 years or something. But eventually the new generation, younger priests, you don't really become a priest today if all you want to do is oppose the old style of the church. What's the point of that? So new young priests are typically discovering the beauty of traditional church music. But I don't mind if they don't use traditional music. I don't mind if they use modern music, as long as it's good music. It has to be good music. Worship music is very powerful in the history of Christianity. It has to be good music. We shouldn't be scared of Latin. We had an old priest, a young priest at the parish I used to go to, and the old priest would always have these terrible, dreary folk songs. And then when he was away, the young priest would choose Veni, Veni, Emmanuel in the original Latin, sung in a single solo voice. And of course, it was so beautiful that people would gather in the foyer of the church afterwards and say, that pierced my soul, that music. And so we need to choose good music. We want to emphasise food. I'm very closely connected to a group of Sikhs, the Indian Sikh religion. They have a fabulous meal at the end of every service. It's always a vegetarian meal, and it's rice, it's dal, curry, it's vegetables, it's salad, it's kheera, sweet rice and so on for dessert. It's Indian sweet. They have no trouble recruiting young people because the Indian students in Australia, that's the only good meal they get every week. So they'll come to the temple and they'll listen to 3 hours of the Granthi being chanted. It's a kind of Asian version of Gregorian chant, really. In Punjabi, it doesn't have to be in the vernacular language or anything like that. No other religion went down this sort of particular road that we chose. Partly they'll come to get the food, and food is a good thing. Community is obviously a good thing. We've got to offer welcome, care, phone call if someone doesn't show up. We've got to offer substance, knowledge, content, intellectual substance. I mean, young people yearn for intellectual substance. Jordan Peterson, he's not everyone's cup of tea, and he's a little bit eccentric, and I don't agree with everything he says, but he writes beautifully about the Bible, and he does podcasts. A friend of mine, John Anderson, did a webcast with him, went for an hour and a half, and John said to him afterwards, I'll edit that down to something more manageable. He said, no, leave it at an hour and a half. And it got tens or hundreds of thousands of views, most of them young men. Young men are so confused, they're desperately, all the contemporary culture tells them is that masculinity is terrible and they're evil and everything. The worst way to try to bring up a man is to tell him that masculinity is bad. And Jordan Peterson gives them a Bible-based masculine example. And he does it with tremendous intellectual substance. In fact, he can even be quite hard to keep up with. I've interviewed him face to face, and it's pretty rocky to stay with him, But young people especially, but all human beings, want substance. The earliest church, it's not true to say the earliest church was simple and didn't care about doctrine. The earliest church produced Tertullian and Irenaeus and Ignatius. These people were thinking through what they believed at the deepest possible level. And there was never a distinction, a contradiction between their belief and their practice. So I've just spent a long time with St. Augustine, whom I'm going to try to write a chapter about for this book. St. Augustine is terrific. What a great journalist he was. Lord, make me pure, but not yet. What a great headline that is. And all of the great theology that he came up with was really him dealing with pastoral problems in his diocese and trying to work them out. And then he'd work them out and write out the working out of them. And he shaped modern Christianity, Western civilization. It was all really shaped in Africa. Tertullian, Origen and Augustine. Now the African Christian church was later swept away, but modern Christianity, Western Christianity was shaped by Africans. Christian Africans, because we are the universal religion. We must use social media effectively. There's a paradox about social media. By its nature, it's pretty destructive because it promotes very short attention spans and, it's very distracting and so forth. Even I can't do any technology, but I check my phone all the time. We had friends and the wife, I'll never say who they are, but they're now divorced, and the wife used to say, if only my husband would treat me with the same degree of care and attention that he devotes to his mobile phone, which he consults first thing in the morning and last thing at night. He makes sure it's got plenty of sustenance, he's always attentive to it and so forth. So that's a problem. That's a pathology in modern life. And yet, people live on social media, and they must be able to find Christ on social media. So we need to do all of that and all of the above, and we have every reason to be completely optimistic because we follow a God who knows his way out of the grave. Thank you. Shall I stay here?
Okay, thanks very much, Greg, for that magnificent presentation. So we'll go to questions. We'll try and get as many questions in as we can. There's one here in the middle, another one over there. Thanks, Chris. Another one up the front here. Another one up the front. Thank you. So the first question is from Dave McLennan from Reed. How do you think a post-Christian society differs from a pre-Christian society? Is it less open to the gospel, more hostile, and how does this shape our approach to mission?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So these are slightly artificial terms which I've used, but I was very happy to see that Archbishop Fisher used them in a major lecture in the US as well. So I think post-Christian are people who know something about Christianity and have rejected Christianity. Generally in principle, sometimes only in practice. I mean, so this is a long continuum rather than neat categories. But post-Christian, and Rod Dreher uses the image of being inoculated against Christianity. You've had a very mild dose of Christianity and you've developed antibodies to it. So if it comes back into your life, you say, no, been there, done that, I know all about that. That was a boring rubbish my grandparents did. We're not interested in that. Very, very hard to get those people back. Although, if they do have a crisis of unbelief, as most people do, depending what their knowledge level is, they know some of the categories that can help them come back. So there are pluses and minuses in each category. Then we're also a Christian society. We may be 30 or 40% of our society may be believing Christians, and maybe 10% of the society or a bit less go to church. So that's a real element too. So we're not exactly the same as the first Christians in a pagan society, because they were certainly not 30 or 40% of ancient Rome in the first years after Jesus' death and resurrection. But then the pre-Christian society is quite radically different. These are people who have really never heard of Christianity. In one of Archbishop Fisher's talks or memoirs or something, he talks about being in Europe and being approached by some Americans, and he agreed to show them around, and they actually said to him, who is this lady and the child in all of these, you can't believe it, but it's true. When I was a kid 50,000 years ago, every Christmas movie that you watch had a religious dimension. Miracle on 34th Street or It's a Wonderful Life or whatever. There was religious belief. The angel was in It's a Wonderful Life. And in the next year, the Academy Award nominated film The Bishop's Wife, the angel was Cary Grant. That's about as good as it ever got for angels in terms of human publicity. The most glamorous man on the planet. Mind you, angels, Hollywood is stuck with angels. In Meet Joe Black, the angel was Brad Pitt. That's not bad. I mean, I don't know why the church doesn't talk more about angels. They're very big in popular culture, But now the Christmas movies are Home Alone or Love Actually. There's not one speck of religious content in any of those things. So you have whole generations of people who are innocent, virtuous pagans, who have no knowledge of the claims of Christianity or its content or the person of Jesus Christ or whatever. Now, I think really they are much more of an opportunity to evangelise than post-Christians, because if you tell them that, you know, God loves them and Jesus died for them, that all human beings will face the four last things, death, judgment, heaven, hell, this is striking. And they already believe a whole miscellany of unbelievably silly, crazy, weird things. You know, as Sheridan said, when people stop believing in Christianity, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything, you know. So witchcraft is on the rise, all sorts of crazy things. But we are selling a message. We're not selling it for financial gain, but we are selling a message which is intensely attractive and which has the advantage of being true to people who are not immunised against it. Therefore, I think they provide us a better chance. But you've got to go out and find them and meet them where they are on social media or in coffee shops or wherever. And there are a lot of new Christian movements that do this, a lot of signs of new life in the church.
Okay, thanks, Greg. We've got at least 16 questions here. And we'd like to invite you to stay for supper afterwards. And we conclude these about 10 to 9, so we have to keep moving. Harriet Elvin from Forest asks, how do we respond to those who say the Catholic Church has lost its moral compass and has no right to take ethical positions on issues because of the Church's liability of sex abuse of children?
Well, the sex abuse scandal is the worst thing any of us has ever known about the Catholic Church, and as Catholics we're all ashamed of that episode. But the truth is, being a Christian doesn't exempt you from the human condition. We're fallen creatures, and we're prone to evil. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn put it, the line between good and evil doesn't run down the middle of a room with good people on one side and bad people on the other side. It runs down the middle of every human heart. And people can start off with a heroic vision of vocation and end up as child abusers. The church handled it very badly. A lot of things you can think about and read about in relation to it. I think it was not more prevalent in the church than in other institutions. The state has chosen not to inquire into other institutions. But every time you pull the rug back on a state school system, you find it was pervasive. I mean, there was a period in history where it was pervasive. And there was an ideology for a time that adult-child love was okay. That was in the 60s, a common ideology. I do think it's always been there. It's in the scriptures. There is plenty of references in the Old Testament to fathers having sex with their daughters and so on. It's a perennial human wickedness, terrible human temptation, which has always been there. You find the early church saying if there is a priest who takes advantage of someone making a confession, they should be excommunicated and they will suffer punishment. You know, Jesus himself says, I forget the exact quote, but if you do it to the least of these, it would better that you were never born. It's not quite those words, I just can't call the quote, but you know what I mean. And so this is a terribly serious matter. But none of that exempts us from the need to tell the truth. We have a mission as a church to go forth and proclaim the truth. And if people say, sucks boo to you, you're associated with an institution which for a time harboured some abusers, well, that's just another part of bearing the cross, isn't it? That doesn't mean that you get to abandon telling the truth. That doesn't mean where it says in the gospel, go and convert all the nations and bring my name to all peoples, that he was only joking. He only said that if you are connected with an institution which never committed any sins. You've just got to go forward and do it. The modern church, I think, has certainly taken this issue very, very seriously. I mean, the magnificent Cardinal Pell, who was completely innocent and went to jail because he was a Catholic prelate, because he became the scapegoat for the culture, and because he talked back to the culture. As soon as he became Archbishop in Melbourne, he put in the Melbourne response, and that was the most forward-leaning response at the time. Wasn't adequate. Looking back, you'd say it was an inadequate response, but it was the most forward-leaning response at the time. And I know now that, in the parish I'm part of in Melbourne, with, child-safe culture and so on pervades absolutely everything we do. At News Corp, we've known about this for a long, long time. We've had all glass offices, computers that only face inwards so that everyone can see them, no alcohol on the premises. I mean, this human wickedness is everywhere. And the final thought I'd give you, a reflection of Pope Benedict on this. Benedict, the most wonderful teacher and writer. I mean, I think John Paul II was the greatest pope of many hundreds of years, but Benedict, a wonderful teacher and writer. This ridiculous movie, The Two Popes, portrayed him as lacking a sense of humour. Well, that's absurd. Everything he writes screams, screamingly funny. There's a wonderful piece he did on biblical scholarship where he said, we'll know the Antichrist when he comes because he'll have a German postdoctoral fellowship in biblical studies. And we'll just have written a path-breaking study and so on. But he makes very sophisticated, complex consideration of this child abuse issue. And one thing he says is, when priests lose the sense of the divine, they very quickly despair. It's a very despairing situation if you are a priest and you no longer believe in the divine economy. That's no excuse for any priest to do anything wicked. If they find themselves in that circumstance, they should leave the priesthood or something. They should do anything before abusing children. But the loss of the sacred is also an element of this. But I have no neat formula except to say we must go on with our mission.
Thank you. Donald Smith from Pierce, who's a journalist with Catholic Voice, asked a very commendably succinct question. What hope is there for a federal religious discrimination act, and do we really need it?
Look, the answer is I don't really know. But as I say, not knowing never stops me having a strong opinion. I think probably it's almost certain that anything we could get past Parliament would do more harm than good. Really, there's a lot you could say about religious freedom back and forth and everything. Most of our freedoms are common law freedoms, and they've grown up according to customary law and common sense. When you lose common sense and consensus, you've got to try to legislate for every conceivable possibility. Things which were just ruled by custom and consensus and common sense. I don't think we'll make a very good fist of it if we do try to legislate that. I think rather you've just got to look at specific freedoms for our institutions. We've got to be able to teach Christian faith, got to be able to operate our schools, got to be able to operate our hospitals in accordance with Christian ethics and teaching. Same with our old folks' homes. We don't have to be open to the kill teams to come in and kill folks, and our adoption agencies and so on. And so I'm a 1,000,000% a warrior for religious freedom, but I don't think any legislation will be likely to do more good than harm. I would just emphasise specific institutional freedoms.
Thank you. This is from Jeff Page. Does it please or sadden you that an atheist or an agnostic is never likely to be president of the US? And part of the question refers to Putin's Russia. Is that a credit to Russian Orthodox Christianity?
So I don't accept the first part of the question. I think Donald Trump was an atheist or an agnostic. I mean, made the most pro forma. Somebody asked him what his favourite Bible passage was. He said, is that a real estate development in New York or what? And I think, the United States is more religious than we are, but it's on the same trend of secularisation that we're on, exactly the same trend, but it starts from a higher base. It's been more religious than we are for a long time. Now some of that has been politicised and so on. As to Russia, no, I think Russia is a hideous defamation, caricature and slander on religion. Putin is a modern, murderous, butcher, totalitarian dictator of the worst kind. He is an enemy of Christianity, front and centre, back and forth, up and down. He was formed in the KGB, and the only element of him which is different from the KGB is that he is a deep Russian nationalist, because it serves his own personal aims as dictator. I think the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia has disgraced itself by becoming the approving chaplain of one of the most brutal, savage and ugly dictatorships in the modern world. I'm very glad that the Patriarch of the Orthodox facilitated the Ukrainian Orthodox Church breaking away from the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't think, I mean, of course there are very good, faithful Russian Orthodox religious believers, of course they are. But the idea that Putin, you know, Putin just murdered Alexei Navalny. Navalny was a brave, conscientious, dedicated, true believing Christian, inspired by the Sermon on the Mount. I think he'll be canonised eventually in the Orthodox faith. Putin murdered him because of his Christian faith and witness for freedom. Navalny wouldn't have gone back to Russia if he hadn't been inspired by the life and message of Christ. And Putin murdered him. And that Putin goes out and says he's a great Christian leader because he, you know, subsidises Russian Orthodox church buildings it's not the least of the grotesque assaults on Christianity in our time today. And really any Western Christian who finds inspiration in Vladimir Putin needs to, first of all, go to confession, and second of all, go and consult a doctor.
Left us with no having views on Vladimir Putin, Rick, which is good. Reverend Dr. Bruce Stevens from the Wesley Uniting Church in Forest asks, has the church missed a major cultural shift from a guilt culture to a shame culture? Do we need to rethink our approach to the gospel and sacraments and so forth? The pre-Christian population on social media is clearly part of a shame culture.
Yeah, so look, that's a very profound question. And you know, I apologise if I said anything slightly sectarian. Every now and again I get lulled into a false sense of security when I think it's a completely Catholic audience. And I go into my Catholic jokes, and you know, we Catholics, we sound like we're from Mars, if you're not familiar. You know,
I think the first question was from the Anglican rector of Reed, is that right?
Oh, so there you go. Well, God bless you, you're so tolerant and easygoing. I could have done a version of this which was much more, you know, much less Roman, if you know what I mean. The guilt culture to the shame culture, that's true. I mean, you can't avoid guilt. Guilt is reality. You can't avoid evil. That ridiculous hymn, "Come as you are." Absolutely, you should come as you are. But you don't stay as you are. After you get there, you're transformed. You leave quite different. You're transformed. You know, there's no point in the gospel where Christ says to a sinner, "Hallelujah, let's celebrate your sin." That's fantastic. What he says is, "I won't condemn you. I will redeem you. I'll put my arm around you. I'll love you. Go and sin no more." And our culture is telling us that it's wrong to attribute guilt. Now, the most intelligent elements of our culture say this quite explicitly. I did a TV debate a few years ago. It was an episode of Q&A, but there was a lot of debate in it with Peter Singer, the atheist philosopher. Now, he believes that handicapped children should be left to die because they have less utility than, you know, a sentient mammal, a dog or a cat or an ape or something. And I put this to him on Q&A, and he said, "Yes, that's what I believe." And he said, "Well, what are you saying, Greg? Are you saying they should be kept alive just because they're human beings, just because they're members of our species?" I said, "Yes, absolutely, just because they're human beings." And if you have a non-guilt view of life, that's where you end up. You end up at the Peter Singer view. Now, I'm not criticising him. He is a very fine person, and he thinks these things through to their logical conclusion, which our friends in the secular world find very disorienting. He's very disorienting in the abortion debate. He says, well, look, if you're willing to kill a baby 5 minutes before it's born, why aren't you willing to kill it 5 minutes after it's born? And he said, I can't see. don't accuse me of inconsistency. This is very disconcerting. One of my fellow panellists of that night was a handicapped person, and after the program he said to me, you're right. Well, he didn't accept my argument altogether, but he said, this point is true. That view of life doesn't value handicapped life, And then when we move to the shame culture, it's essentially a cultural shame. So, if you don't sign up to all the contemporary pagan positions on sex and identity and race and all the rest of it, colonialism, heteronormativity, economic exploitation, whatever junk you want, if you don't sign up to all that, it is shameful. And so the crowd gathers round and kicks you to death if you dare to talk. That's really what happened to George Pell. And I don't know exactly whether that makes us rethink. Might make us rethink our evangelical strategy. I don't think it should make us rethink any of our truths, because our truths are true or they're not true. They're either true or not true. They're not true according to what the culture says. I mean, it is either wrong to kill innocent human life, or it's not. It can't be wrong yesterday but right tomorrow. I mean, that can apply to, trivial cultural things, standards of dress or something, or codes of politeness, but not to any important issue.
I've got two questions here that reflect on Catholic education. Leonard from Curtin raises this point, which I'll abbreviate. There are still many Catholic schools in Australia with a lot of children who have studied through primary and secondary school, yet almost no young people attend church. What's gone wrong? And another question along the same lines, how do we ensure that a Catholic community has a foundational Catholic education?
Well, I don't think we can blame Catholic education for the low practice rate. Part of the crisis of faith in contemporary society is a crisis of knowledge, so we should address that. But that's only one part of the crisis of faith. The fact that the sociologists tell us that Christians know nothing of what their denominations nominally believe, that should be disturbing. So one modest suggestion I have in the book is, I say every Christian school should spend a term or a year going through the Apostles' Creed, or the Nicene Creed if you like, clause by clause. So at least once in their life, every Christian who attends a Christian school will have come to grips with a systematic recitation of Christian belief. But of course, that is not going to turn everybody into a believing Christian. Of course not. Creating a real community. So I had a lot to do with that wonderful institution, Campion College in Sydney. And look, if any of you are about to die and you have $50 million in your will and you can't work out where to leave it to Campion College. Because I don't think there's an institution in Australia that does a better job. It's a liberal arts college in the Catholic tradition. And it's magnificent. Now that's a sympathetic community. It doesn't guarantee everyone who graduates from there is going to be a believing Catholic, and indeed there are lots of non-Catholics there, non-Catholic Christians, and there are some non-Christians there, some Muslims and so on. But they get acquainted with the great books, and they do it through the lens of the Catholic tradition. And you go out into the world much better equipped as a result of that kind of education. So we do, Rod Dreher argues in the Benedict option that we have to do a certain amount of withdrawal, whereas I think you can overdo withdrawal, but on the other hand you've got to have a bit of withdrawal. Even going to church every week for an hour and a half, that's a withdrawal from the maelstrom of society. Every time you get down and pray to God, that's a withdrawal from the maelstrom of society. But some Christian schools don't take their Christian element very seriously. Some take it tremendously seriously. So I wish that they would all impart the knowledge. I wish they would all model Christian behaviour and life. But I'm not at all willing to blame them for the general cultural stagnation. I mean, if kids go to a Catholic school from a family which doesn't practice the faith, it's very hard for the school to make up for that. I've got a very dear friend who's a conscientious atheist from a non-Christian background, lives in a posh part of Sydney, sent his daughters to a very high-class Anglican school, and he said to me, the last thing I ever expected, she became a Christian, you know, and he didn't mind. He's an unusually open-minded atheist. He was quite okay that his daughter became a religious Christian, but that was absolutely the very last thing that would have gone through his head in choosing a Christian school for his daughter. So, and I think, you know, God rejoices with one soul, so I think every Catholic school has done good work, and but I'd like them to be very explicit, to have some substance, all the rest of it. But, you know, most of them I think are doing their best.
Okay, one thing that we've observed